Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks a lot for being here. I appreciate your leadership actually in this area, as you were the first elected official throughout the region to come when we first invited you back in 2010, and have kept in touch with us on a very consistent basis with what's going on in the region. And I commend you for that because I see that as a communication leadership. And it's the first piece I wanted to touch on. We talked a little bit earlier this morning of the number of events you're at, putting feet on the ground, shaking hands, having people reach out to you and communicate to you. You're as active and interactive as a communicator online via your Twitter feed and your Facebook feed and what you're doing via your website. How are you doing that old school as well as you're doing new school?
One, I do think just for representative government, it's important for me to stay in touch, and secondly, for the 710,000 people I represent to be able to stay in touch with me. Sometimes that is literally touching you at a pancake breakfast at St. Mary's Church in Crown Point, VFW chili dinner, whatever it may be. On the other hand, as someone on my staff suggested to me some years ago, my father, who is now 96, played his politics and did his public service in places like the Glen Park Demo Club, Marco's Tavern on Ridge Road, the two Lithuanian parishes whose buildings do no longer exist in Lake County, and that's how he was very successful. When I began running in 1983, I would do St. Casimir Church and the 200 ethnic people who came out once a month for the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Democratic Club of North Hammond, who originally kept their minutes in Polish, and other clubs such as that. For all practical purposes, and the FDR Club still exists, but a mere shadow of those 200 people that used to show up once a month, people communicate differently today. They communicate through the internet, through Facebook, through Twitter, and it is my responsibility, I feel, to reach out to those individuals to make myself available in that media and to hear back from them in that media. And so I must say some of the credit goes to putting it into perspective for me. Some years ago that life evolves and don't get stuck.
Yep. Well, and I think you see that. You're out at these town forums. That was a great experience for you to interact with people directly. Tell me some of the kind of feedback that you heard.
It was very good feedback in terms of question and getting a sense of what people are concerned about. Also, it gives people a chance who just may not have the wherewithal or desire to sit down any longer and write something out to show up. But the thing that changed this year, and it was new this year, is to be able to tape one of our forums and to put it up online. So again, despite the fact that I did 24 forums over an entire week in 5 counties, some people, based on work schedule and illness, childcare duties, whatever, maybe just couldn't do it. So if nothing else, they could hear essentially what that presentation looked like, and also had an entire week in which to, through the media, write any question and communicate any question they had to us and get a response back. So even if you weren't at the forum, in a sense, and it was a shadow of the forum itself, you could still participate by seeing what I said and go ahead and ask me a question and you're going to get a response back.
So the principal premise of the individual taxpayer that is communicating with you is your voice can be heard. You've got just about every outlet you could imagine for them to have that voice heard.
Right, and I tell people, setting aside the social media for a second, I also have a responsibility to try to hear those I'll never hear from. And I always use Medicaid recipients compared to Medicare recipients. As you can imagine, at most of our forums, Medicare is a very broad-based middle-class program. I hear from people who are rightfully concerned about the future of the program. For Medicaid, for those who are indigent in our society, they're just trying to get through today and the end of the day. They may not even know who their representative is. If they do, they may have lost hope that it's going to make any difference. They may not have a stamp to put on the envelope to send to me, let alone know where I exist. So I also do have that responsibility on top of everything else. But I do really think the internet has been a fabulous opportunity to make sure all of those 700,000 people have that chance, and even for people who may not have the financial wherewithal, obviously you have access to our public library and other types of public offices.
Um, if you turn on the TV news at night, if you turn on the radio, if you open the paper, if you read magazines, if you read blogs, it's difficult to actually find a lot of examples of people that are getting along in politics. It's a pretty contentious time at the federal level. It's a pretty contentious time at the state level. Depending on the community, it's a pretty contentious time within the community. Tell us, are there people truly getting along? Are there people working in sync? And what do you do to build on those models so that the public can trust that there is a lot getting done, despite maybe the rancor about some individual topics?
It's why Velpa Light's very important, because I do draw a distinction between media and news. And unfortunately, and I hate to stereotype, but most national news today, with the exception of PBS and a couple of other rare exceptions, is what I characterize as media. Is four people at a counter giving their opinion on a snippet of what may be news. Some of it is just factually incorrect, and for all practical purposes, I've stopped watching it. The one that always sticks in my mind is a commentator on such and such TV station saying, "We've had these deficits for decades and decades and decades." That's not true. We had a balanced budget in 2001. Regardless of your opinion on the budget, that
Just
statement
get the
is not
facts
true.
right.
Just get the facts straight. And I have ostensibly 3 reporters sitting there and all nodding knowingly, "Oh yeah, boy, that's terrible." Why don't you ask, or have you checked that fact? That's not true with facilities such as yours and others locally, the local media. They're trying to at least get facts out, and we may disagree, and then we can have a disagreement and argument.
But you get the basic
But you
common
get the-
piece
you
of
get the piece.
knowledge out, and then the person can
Right.
make their own decision.
So that has been, I think, also very destructive of the political process in a good sense of the word. And you are correct. If you watch that, and that's all you see, and that's your only source, you would think all we do all day is fight each other, argue, and mud wrestle. The example I have used is for all the rancor that you see, and it exists. There's no question about it. I sit on the Appropriations Committee. Our committee is charged with funding the operation of the government, not inconsequential. We spend about 1 out of every $3 that actually is expended by the federal government, but it runs the government, the Department of Defense, Education, pick an agency. We pass this year with a Republican House and a Democratic Senate, Democratic President, all 12 of our bills negotiated, met all of our budget targets, and the total amount of money was $1 trillion. That is not an inconsequential feat. And as you describe it, you had adults in charge. If Rodney Frelinghuysen, a Republican from New Jersey who was my chairman on energy and water, he was my ranking member a year ago. If Bill Young, the chairman of the Defense Subcommittee on which I served from Florida, Republican, was here, you would have a respect for them, you would end up developing a friendship with them, and we get along. And we do not agree all of the time. We work our differences out, because if we do not agree, then you close that section of the government down.
Yep.
So there is some tradition, if you would, some learned experience, literally over 2 centuries of the committee, that we have to get our work done, and it tends to attract those kind of people. So I have told my constituents, we have some sharp divisions. I am very concerned about the institution of the Congress and its inability, both houses, forget parties, to make permanent decisions. We got a big problem. I'm concerned about it. But there are some centers of gravity to build on. All hope is not yet lost.
How do you bring that perspective back to Indiana in their discussions right now, whether it's right to work or whether it's educational funding? There's an awful lot of insurance concerns, and same thing at a local level where you've got a very conflicted region, heavily Democratic areas, strong Republican growth, battles between the region and the state. Who do you reach out to in the state level that you find you can come to common ground with, and who do you work with regionally that you find that you can come to common ground with?
The simple answer is everyone. You look at Porter County, we now have Mayor Snyder in Portage. Happens to be a Republican, they tell me. Have had a very productive meeting very early on at the request of the mayor to sit down and see which federal projects we have been working on in the city of Portage to make sure we have open communication and how we ought to proceed. Have had a long-standing relationship with Mayor Casas in Valparaiso. You look at the cooperation he's engaged in at the state level for improvements along US 30. Think about some of the work we've done with the city for sewers. His coordination with the university, we've tried to be helpful in that area as well. The election's over. I'm certain if you talk to John Casas right now, he's very proud he's a Republican. I'm proud I'm a Democrat. We fortunately won our elections, or from some people's perspective, unfortunately won our elections. We got to work together.
Yep.
And I tell people in Northwest Indiana, and I bet you find it in the people you talk to, perception does lag reality.
Oh,
in
yeah.
Lake and Porter County, in that people are getting along and cooperating to a greater degree than before. Do we have farther to go? Sure.
Yep.
But there is more of that going on, and I have not found that to be an impediment. Those who have tended to have their feet just stuck in the ground and unable to move, they've tended to go away, if you would.
What are some of the highlights as we get a little bit broader this year and move into LaPorte County, and then later in the year throughout the region, Lake County and beyond in Northwest Indiana? What are some of the highlights as we go east of here and west of here that you think as a good news-based group we're going to find?
I'm very pleased personally with reapportionment, and I say that from a self-interest standpoint, simply because if you look at the first congressional district as drawn for the next 10 years, having essentially the western quarter of LaPorte County and now all of Porter County and all of Lake County. All of Porter County was not in their first district until this year. It just makes incredible sense. As I describe it, you have all of the industry along the shoreline. You have almost every mile of Indiana shoreline on Lake Michigan. I tell people I remember as a staffer going to a meeting with Congressman Floyd Fithian, Congressman John Bradamus, Congressman Adam Benjamin, deciding where the two entrances to the Indiana dunes were going to be. Very interesting meeting.
Yep.
It was very inconclusive.
Yep.
It's all in one district now, so hopefully you can make a decision absent some of those types of potential problems. And the demographics of Michigan City are almost identical, any way you slice it, to Lake County, Indiana, for example. So demographically it makes sense as well. The first district is now all on one time zone, which
Yep.
I find thrilling
Yeah.
at this point in time.
Didn't have that.
And so, again, you got that commonality, and I also think people have a recognition. We have our own identities. Each community can take joy and pride in its individuality. Valparaiso is the university. You've got the lake in Hobart. Michigan City has the lighthouse and the beach. But also, we're part of the Chicago metropolitan area, and that's how Shore ties us together. The commonality wanting the Gary Airport developed ties us together. And I tell people, Chicago's economy is larger than Switzerland's. We want to maintain our own identity, but it is time we truly make an effort to connect ourselves to take advantage of that economy to build the job base here.
There's probably the last point I would touch upon is there's a tremendous amount of enthusiasm. Some are concerned with a little bit too much enthusiasm or optimism, but how do you see Gary and the potential resurgence of that city? In every meeting that I go to within the region, there seems to be a greater and greater understanding that so goes Gary, goes the region, and you've got people from much farther and much wider actually saying, let's help out, let's really get something done here. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do think there is definitely a perspective outside the city of Gary that we do not benefit and we are hurt if Gary does not do well. And also, I think the willingness of wanting to help is again exemplified by somebody like Mayor Cossett. He is a strong proponent of the Gary Airport. Well, that helps all of us. You can live in Valpo, work there. You can, if somebody in Indiana is paying more tax, I'm ahead of the game.
Yep.
So we're all ahead of the game. I've had my heart broken before. I've had my hopes raised. I think this is the real deal. I think Mayor Freeman Wilson is a very, very bright individual. She ran 3 times to be mayor of Gary. She lost twice. She kept going back and trying to be mayor of Gary because that's what she wants to do with her life. So that sense of dedication and wanting to do something with the job, not for personal aggrandizement, also leads me to believe she'll be successful. You look at the Gary Airport. Unfortunately, we have talked about development of the Gary Airport for several decades.
Yeah.
One of the final stumbling blocks, if you would, is finalizing in writing, signing the contract, agreements with 3 railroads to relocate at the end of the runway so we can begin to spend federal money that is in the pot. One of those has now been signed, Norfolk Southern. 2 more were very close to, and I would never have said that before. Is that going to change the world tomorrow? No, but the mayor is absolutely focused. Let's get one thing done that is very centered on economics, job base, and tax base in Gary. Then let's move on to part 2. There's 1,000 things to do. Let's get one thing done. And
Definitively.
also, yeah, and I think a recognition that no, people want to help. And there's always self-interest in the world, but it's not selfish. They want to help Gary. I grew up at 38th and Madison. It's heartbreaking. You want to help. And I think a recognition, certainly by the mayor, people aren't looking to take over. They want to help. And I want your help.
Yep.
And then we're all going to be ahead of the game. I think this is the real deal.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to share with our sort of Porter County growing, East and West networks? What else do you want them to know maybe the year ahead?
The year ahead, they will see a lot of smoke, fire, rancor in Washington, D.C. The bad news is there are 3 freight trains coming down the road on December 31st and January 1st. One is that the across-the-board cuts that people thought were going to take place this January actually start January 1st, 2013.
Okay.
That is not necessarily bad, but some people are very resistant to them. That's January 1st. The Bush tax cuts expire December 31st. If you remember the significant fight over potential default on the debt and the debt ceiling in July of 2011. Democratic president, Republican leadership in Congress says, we don't want to do this again until when? After the election. You read my mind. So we can view that as a negative. I'm an optimistic person. I say that is going to be really focusing people's attention that the time is up. And the last point I just would make very quickly is 100 of us, 40 Republicans, 60 Democrats, signed a letter to the so-called select committee last year. Said, listen, I don't trivialize $1.5 trillion, but given where we are, that's not going to do it. We said you got to do $4 trillion. You got to put every spending program on the table. You got to put every tax in. So again, there's some centers of gravity to build on, and I would be hopeful that this year you'll see some change by the end of the year.
Well, it looks like plenty on tap. We're going to have a lot
Plenty
to
on
watch. Thanks for keeping us in the communication on what's going on. Thanks very much again for coming by. And we look forward to helping you throughout the year with life.
And thank you for what you do. And I do think it is a very vital opportunity for people to get real information and real news as to what's going on in the community and outside of it that affects Northwest Indiana.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.